Okay. The sugya that I'd like to do with you today begins on Pei Gimel. And specifically on Pei Gimel Amud Beis. You can open up to Daf Pei Gimel Amud Beis. We're going to talk about the following issue. When we have to violate the Shabbos or any other Isur for the sake of Pikuach Nefesh, we have a principle called Hakal Kal Tchil. In other words, if we can save the life of the victim of the Chola, for example, with two different foodstuffs, one of which is what's called an Isur Chabur, and the other is an Isur Kal. Relatively, the second, we'll call it the second, doesn't matter the first or the second, is less stringent than the first. We must choose the second, again, if all things are equal and both are viable options to save the life of the chola, then we'll choose that which is relatively less light. There's a whole hierarchy, a pyramid of isurim going from lower isurim to more intense isurim and so forth. This sugya is going to address the following scenario. The two options for feeding the chola are truma and tevel. Tevel means before they took off trumas and maasros. Now, both, again, if you're not a Kohen, then in both cases, we're dealing with what's called a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim. So it would seem that as far as the severity of the Isur is concerned, they're equal. However, in one fundamental way, they're different, because in the case of Tevel, you can be mafresh, trumas and maasros. Now on Shabbos, we're enjoined from being mafresh, trumas and maasros. But that's only on a D'Rabbanan level. On a D'Oraisa level, you're allowed to be mafresh, trumas and maasros. It doesn't entail a violation of any of the 39 malachos. So now, when we get to this chola, and let's say it's Shabbos, and I want to save his life by feeding him, and all I have is fruits and vegetables, that's teva, it would make sense that rather than give him truma, he's not a Kohen, and there's no way out in the case of truma. In the case of tevel, there's a way out. We could be mafresh, trumas and maasros, albeit violating an Isur D'Rabbanan, but we'll do so for the sake of Pikuach Nefesh, rather than violating an Isur D'Oraisa, feeding him tevel. That's absolutely clear. But what happens if after you mafresh trumas and maasros, given the volume of tevel that you have on your table that's accessible to you, you will not have enough tevel? Well, I shouldn't call it tevel, because again, you took off trumas and maasros, you're left with food. You will not have enough food to save his life. So in any event, you're going to have to use some of the truma. Let's say you need 10 ounces to save his life. Carry him over till we can be matir with other things, right? So we have 5 ounces worth of chulin and another 5 ounces worth of truma. So we'll combine that together in order to save his life. Now, the premise we're operating with is that although Afrashas Trumas and Maasros is prohibited on Shabbos, it's only D'Rabbanan, but eating Truma, if you're not a Kohen, or for anybody to eat Tevel, is an Isur D'Oraisa, which is certainly the case, unless, and here's the exception to the rule, we have what's called an Atzitz She'eno Nokuf. And if you're interested, I gave a shir on the topic of Atzitz She'eno Nokuf as far as Shvius is concerned. Right? Let's say you have a flower pot. are you allowed to take a flower pot on Shvius after this Rosh Hashanah for a full year, take it from your porch and put it down into your garden? What is the status of that which grows inside a flower pot? And now we're talking about Eino Nokuf, which means it's not perforated, it has no holes in it. It's got a flat bottom. If it has a flat bottom, then it doesn't nurture, it doesn't suck up nutrients from the ground because there's a hefsek that interrupts the soil that's inside the flower pot from the soil that's on the ground. And in what we call mitzvahs hatluyos ba'aretz, everything depends upon food that was produced by the ground, was nourished by the ground. Here, he's got fruits growing or grains growing in an atzitz, which is eno nakuv, and it's not growing from the ground. On a doraisa level, there's no chiyuv, no isur tevel, no chiyuv trumas of maestros. The Rabbanan were afraid that if we allow him to consume that which is growing in an atzitz she'eno nakuv, he might come to consume, without being mafresh, that which is growing in atzitz nakuv. He won't be sensitive to the difference between nakuv and eno nakuv. But all that is d'Rabbanan. So now we're dealing with tevel d'Rabbanan if it grew in an atzitz she'eno nakuv. So Rabbah says the following. He has a choice. He could be mafresh trumas and maestros and remove the isur tevel d'Rabbanan, in this case, the tevel d'Rabbanan and atzitz she'eno nakuv. But he will violate the isur d'Rabbanan of hafashas trumas and maestros. The other option would be to feed him the tevel d'Rabbanan without being mafresh trumas and maestros. Now, why is it a tevel d'Rabbanan again? Because it's growing in an atzitz she'eno nakuv. So Rav is of the opinion that I'd rather that he mafresh trumas and maestros and violate that d'Rabbanan on Shabbos, that shvus d'Rabbanan on Shabbos, rather than have him eat tevel, even though the tevel is only d'Rabbanan. And now the Gemara is going to analyze whether Rabbah is simple or is it debatable. Lema tanoihi. Perhaps this din depends upon a machlokas tanoi. Sanya, we learned in the Brisa. Mishen eshachod nachash. A man was never bitten by a snake on Shabbos, and his life is in danger. We call upon the best expert rofe, no matter where he is, even if he has to come michutz l'tchum. Now, this requirement of staying within the Tchum Shabbos is derived in the Gemara in Eruvin on Daf Nun Aleph from the Pasuk Al Yetze Ish Mimkomo B'Yom HaShvi. And you're not let it go Chutz L'Mkomo, which means Yosem Alpayim Amo L'Chol Ruach. Now there's a machlokes in the Gemara in Masechet Sota between Rabbi Akiva and Chachamim, where this is a doraisa or a drabban. But most Rishonim pass like the Chacham in any event, and the whole isur of chutz l'tchum is drabban. Umekarin lo es hatargolos. Targolos. Tarnagolos. Now, for this, we would have to know more about medicine, refuah. I don't know enough to evaluate this, but apparently, if you rip apart a hen, hen, then you're able to put it on a poisonous snake bite. Now, again, here we might be dealing with a violation of an Issa Doraisa. In the case of Chutz L'Tchum, the Rofe is coming out of the Tchum Shabbos, that's only the Rabbanan, except for Rabbi Akiva. But in the case of Korin Esa Tarnagoles, there you talk about a Malacha Doraisa of B'tilas Neshama. But that is not, because once he got bitten by the snake, his life is in the bounds. Next, goes in low, we can cut off from the ground, es hakrishin, a kind of a vegetable that is growing in the ground, would be a violation of meleches ktsira, doraisa, but we're going to allow it, to feed him the krishin, because his life is in danger. The ain't tzarech lomar, the ain't tzarech l'taknom uliasa. Divrei Rebbe. Reb Lazar, Reb Shimon Omer lo yochal ad shi'asa. And we're talking about a yerek, a vegetable that's chayav in meiser midrabanan. And the reason for that is because Trumas Yirokos is only Drabanan. There's no Tevel Doraisa on Yirokos. It's only Dagon Tirosh V'Yitzar. But Midrabanan, he's Chayav in Maaseh. Therefore, says Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon, if Trumas Yirokos is the Rabbanon and you need Afroshas Maaser, then that's exactly what you have to do. Whereas the Tanakama says, Machilin oso v'ein tzarech lias. We're going to give him these Krishin, and we don't require Afrosha. It's a Pikuach Nefesh situation. Why should we bother with Afrosha? And Rebbe says, no, you're obligated to be mafresh Shumas and Maisers. That's the opinion of Rabbi Lazar Reb Shimon. Now, what's interesting here is we're talking about Yerukah. So, in the worst case scenario, the Truma is the Rabbanon, the Tevel is the Rabbanon in the case of Yerukos. So, what's the advantage, according to Rabbi Lazar, of being mafresh in a case of Truma or Tevel to Rabbanon? You're going to violate the Isur of Hafrashas Truma, which is again an Isur Rabbanon on Shabbos. So why do you want to actively violate an Isur Rabbanon by being mafresh, when in the absence of Hafrasha, we're dealing with the Rabbanon anyway, because we're dealing with Trumas Yirakos, which is only the Rabbanon. So the Gemara says, Neymar, shall we say that we go back to Rabbah, and Rabbah says that I'd rather have him violate the Isud Rabbanon of Hafrashas Trumas and Maestros rather than feed him tevel d'Rabbanan in the case of an atzit she'eino nakuv. Again, atzit she'eino nakuv, the entire eats a tevel, it's only d'Rabbanan. I'm not going to feed him tevel. I'm going to be mafresh maser and violate the issa d'Rabbanan of afrashas trumas and ma'asos on Shabbos, rather than feed him tevel d'Rabbanan. And that same sheet of Rabbah is reflected now in the sheet of Rabbi Elazar of Shimon, that in the case of Karshinon, Krishin, we will prefer being mafresh trumas and ma'asos, violating the Isser Shabbos of afrashas trumas and ma'asos, rather than feeding him that which is tevel d'Rabbanan in the case of Yerakos. So if we want to sort of summarize the entire sugya in a way that we'll remember it, we're going to try to line up those shitos who advocate in favor of afrashas trumas and ma'asos on Shabbos, rather than feed him the food as tevel. We want to avoid tevel, even tevel d'Rabbanan at all costs, even if it means being mafresh on Shabbos, which is a violation of the Shvus to Shabbos. The Loki Rebbe. Rebbe was telling us that it's pikuach nefesh. Don't bother wasting your time to be ma'aser V'lo Rebbe. Rebbe said here in this brisa that we don't need to be mafresh trumas and ma'asos from the karti, from the Krishin. So the Gemara rejects afilu tema Rebbe. We can reconcile Rebbe with Rabbah, even though Rabbah insisted on afrashas trumas and ma'asos. Rebbe says in this case we don't need trumas and ma'asos. Ad kan lo kama Rebbe Hassam. When did Rebbe say forget about afrashas trumas and ma'asos? That's only in the case el inyan maser yerek. Isa tevel is anyway d'Rabbanan. So why is it so awful if we allow him to eat this as tevel? And the impression you're getting here is that yerek, even though it's tevel d'Rabbanan, it's not really tevel. I mean, it is tevel, but it's not in any way similar to tevel d'oraisa. Tevel d'oraisa is on grains. Now we're talking about vegetables that grow in the ground. It's tevel d'Rabbanan, but it's on a lower level. Shvus d'Rabbanan, to be mafresh trumas and ma'asos, that's a regular shvus. We're afraid of what's called tikkun, and that becomes like makam and patish, and therefore we want to leave out hafrashas trumas and ma'asos. You'll ask me, but he's eating tevel d'Rabbanan, albeit, but nevertheless it's tevel. The answer is that tevel d'Rabbanan is on a very low level in the hierarchy of chumras havera. Oh. So now let's compare the following two categories. Trumas Yerakos, or Tevel Yerakos, and Otzitz She'eino Nakuf. Now, inside the Otzitz She'eino Nakuf, he has wheat growing. It's one of the 5 species of grains, which is called dagan. When I look at the dagon per se, let's say after he cuts it off, do I know that it's not tevel doraisa? Can I tell a difference between this tevel and tevel doraisa that grew in the ground? They're identical. When the Rabbanan said that you have to be mafresh trumas and maisro from otzitz sheno nakuv, what they meant to say is that in the minds of the people, it looks and tastes exactly like tevel doraisa. We have to be very, very careful with a case of an otzitz she'eno nakuv. And therefore, even though Rebbe, in the case of Yerakos, of what was it called, Krishan, what was it called, Krishan, he would advocate eating it as is. He would not advocate eating it as is in the case of an otzitz she'eno nakuv. Rabbah is correct, even according to Rebbe, that in the case of otzitz she'eno nakuv, we're going to encourage him to be mafresh trumas and maisros before he feeds the cholah, because otherwise it might be mistaken or it's identical in its appearance to an otzitz nakuv, meaning to something that grows from the ground, which is tevel doraisa. So the Gemara says, afilu tema Rebbe. Let's go over the Gemara inside. It's possible that we can reconcile Rabbah with Rebbe. Why? Even though Rebbe holds that we're not going to be mafresh maser in the case of Krishan, ad kan lo kam Rebbe Yosin Elinian maser yerek d'Rabbanan, and we're not afraid that from tevel d'Rabbanan, if you allow him to eat, it'll come to eat tevel doraisa. There's nothing similar that could lead him to make that error in confusing a vegetable with a grain. Avol b'maisa dagan, in a case of grain, which is the real bona fide tevel doraisa and truma doraisa, just that in this case, where's the grain growing? It's in a non-perforated flower pot. The tevel doraisa, we can now possibly, heaven forbid, confuse this with tevel doraisa in a case where they did a harvest of grains that grew from the ground. Therefore, b'maser dagon the tevel doraisa afilu Rebbe moda. The ish sharisle the otzitz she'enu nakuv osi lemechal beotzitz she'u nakuv. If we're going to allow him to eat, says Rebbe, tevel, Rabbah, but we're now claiming that Rebbe would accept Rabbah. But Rabbah said if you can allow him to eat tevel from an otzitz she'enu nakuv, he will easily, quite statistically, quite probably make a mistake and think that you're allowed to eat otzitz nakuv, because at the end of the day, these grains are growing in a flower pot. And if you're going to be matir one flower pot, he'll think that any grains growing in any flower pot could be mutter. Therefore, Rabbah was very strict in the case of otzitz she'eno nakuv, because it's absolutely identical with an otzitz hanakuv, in terms of the grain itself, and we have to be afraid that he'll confuse tevel d'Rabbanan with tevel doraisa, and he might come to the matir and eat tevel doraisa, which is a chiyuv misa b'dei shamayim. Therefore, we're going to require, says Rabbah, that he be mafresh trumas and maisros from the otzitz she'enu nakuv before we feed it to the cholah, because the chumras avera, even though again hafrashas trumas and maisros is itself an isur d'Rabbanan on Shabbos, eating from this tevel of the otzitz she'enu nakuv is itself a d'Rabbanan. But one d'Rabbanan is more chomer than the other. We can put on the scale not only different machalas asurus doraisa, going from here all the way up to here, we can even put on the scale d'Rabbanans. And we decide which d'Rabbanan is more chamer. and it has to be treated not lightly but heavily. And that's going to be the case of otzitz she'eno nakuv, because we're going to be matir in otzitz she'eno nakuv is asi lemichal. He might come to eat pears at a tevel of otzitz nakuv. But in a case of Yerakos, where the Torah says you're only chayiv in truma of dagan, Yerakos are excluded. The Rabbanan said that we're going to require you to be mafresh shumas and maisros from dagan. I'm sorry, from Yerakos, even though it's not dagan. That's already a secondary issue. That's not a real chashash that'll come to tevel doraisa in the case of grains of dagan. The distinction between Yerakos and dagan is so obvious and so easy to understand that we would not be afraid of confusing one from the other. And therefore, says Rebbe, I advocate feeding the cholev this tevel of Yerakos, the ein tzarich li'as, without being mafresh mas, because the iser of eating tevel from Yerakos is less severe than tevel from an otzitz she'eno no. Hey, Rabotai, this is where we're going to stop for today. And tomorrow, I'd like to cover with you the famous sugya of bulmus, someone who gets tremendous hunger pains on Yom Kippur. Under what circumstances and how can we feed him and bring him back to restore his health? Because bulmus is a condition that is very dangerous to human life. Okay, then, wishing you a great day.